This is Parjanya Sen of the Department of English, Sanada Degree College, Darjeeling, and this lecture is being made available to you courtesy Radio Solution 90.8 FM. This lecture is intended for the students pursuing their program course under North Bengal University, and today I'm going to be talking about a poem entitled Composed Upon Westminster Bridge, September 3rd, 1802 by William Wordsworth, which is part of the DSC paper 4 in the 4th semester. Okay. Now before I come to the poem itself, a bit about the poet William Wordsworth. His dates are 1770 to 1850, and Wordsworth was an English romantic poet, and together with Samuel Taylor Coleridge, he helped to launch the Romantic Age in English literature. Okay, Wordsworth and Coleridge, they published the lyrical ballads in 1798. And what were the characteristics of the Romantic poets? The Romantic poets were deeply drawn towards nature. Okay, their poems are characterized by a return to nature. Now, what does it mean? They were disillusioned with the Industrial Revolution, particularly with the highly mechanized and urbanized existence which followed in the aftermath of the Industrial Revolution in urban centers such as London. And for them, nature was a space for recuperation or recovery of the self, of the poetic self. Now, Wordsworth famously describes poetry. Now, what is poetry, or the act of writing poetry? Wordsworth describes poetry as, quote, a spontaneous overflow of powerful emotions recollected in tranquility, unquote. And what is Wordsworth trying to say? That it is nature which facilitates this spontaneous overflow of powerful emotion, and nature also produces a sense of tranquility and peace, and it enables the poet to be at peace with himself, and also it enables a certain recovery of the self, a self that is lost in the aftermath of the Industrial Revolution, of capitalism, and of the Industrial Revolution and urbanization. Okay, now one more thing to remember about the Romantic poets is that they were deeply influenced by the French Revolution of 1791 and by the ideals of universal brotherhood and universal human rights. Okay, so for them the French Revolution was a romantic ideal of was a revolutionary ideal of sorts, and they sought to escape the exceedingly or the growingly urbanized and mechanized centers such as London. Okay, now coming to this particular poem, which is entitled Composed Upon Westminster Bridge, September 3rd, 1802. Now this poem presents a paradox in the sense that it is a sonnet which is written about London. Okay, and the poet and his sister Dorothy Wordsworth, they're taking a walk in the early hours of the morning across Westminster Bridge, and they are looking at the sun rising. It's the time of dawn and the sun is rising over the cityscape of London, and both Wordsworth and his sister Dorothy, they're witnessing this sight, and it influences Wordsworth. Okay, it fills him with a sense of tranquility and calm. Now, what is the paradox here? The paradox is that London is an urban center. Okay, London is ideally not one of the natural places or natural spots that Wordsworth talks about in his other poems. Okay, so the paradox lies in the fact that London here fills the poet with a sense of peace and a sense of calm, and London isn't exactly what the poet would mean by nature or by the countryside. Okay, so this is the paradox which is intrinsic within the poem. Okay, now the poem itself is written in the tradition of a Petrarchan sonnet. Now, what is the Petrarchan sonnet? The sonnet, as you know, it is a poem comprising 14 lines and comprising two parts. The first 8 lines are called the octave, and the last 6 lines are called the sestate. Now, what is a Petrarchan sonnet? The sonnet originated in Florence, Italy, and the father of sonnet writing is said to have been Francisco Petrarca, or popularly known as Petrarch. Okay, he originated the form of the sonnet. The word sonnet, of course, comes from the phrase sonetto, meaning song in Italian. Okay, it was sung by the wandering minstrels or troubadours before it was formalized as a poetic medium. Okay, now from Petrarch, the name Petrarchan sonnet owes its origin. Okay, now although the English sonnet, and there were very famous English sonneteers such as, you have already covered them in your syllabus, such as Spenser, Shakespeare, Sidney, etc. And although the English sonnet or the Spenserian sonnet, it differs in form from the Petrarchan sonnet in that it comprises 3 quatrains, that is 3 stanzas of 4 lines each and 1 couplet. This particular sonnet by Wordsworth, it is going back to the Petrarchan form, okay, the Petrarchan form of sonnet writing. Okay, another thing, as I already mentioned, this poem is composed by Wordsworth while he was taking a walk at the early hours of dawn with his sister Dorothy and as he sees the city from the Westminster Bridge. Okay, now in her journal entry dated the 31st of July 1802, Dorothy, who is described as Wordsworth, quote-unquote, exquisite sister, writes, and I'm quoting Dorothy, "It was a beautiful morning. The city St. Paul's," she's referring to the cathedral here, "the city St. Paul's with the river and a multitude of little boats made a most beautiful sight as we crossed Westminster Bridge. The houses were not overhung by their cloud of smoke, and they were spread out endlessly, yet the sun shone so brightly with such a fierce light that there was even something like the purity of one of nature's own grand spectacles." Now Wordsworth, he read this journal entry by his sister, and then he composed the poem and finished writing it on September 3rd, 1802, as the title itself is indicated as the date itself is indicated within the title of the poem. And sort of the Wordsworth infuses this poem with the spirit of his sister Dorothy. That is something else you must remember while we are reading this poem. Now, let's look at the poem itself. I told you this is an example of a sonnet. So Wordsworth writes, "Earth has not anything to show more fair. Dull would he be of soul who could pass by a sight so touching in its majesty." Okay, so he's describing the city of London in the early hours of dawn, and he's describing it as a sight most fair. Okay, and he's describing the sight as something that heals the soul. Okay, and he's describing the majestic city of London. London seems to be majestic in its urban sort of sprawl. "The city now doth like a garment wear the beauty of the morning silent bear." Okay, here is an example of personification. The city is being personified here, and the city seems to wear the morning light like a garment, like a dress. Okay, it is dressed in the light of dawn. "Ships, towers, domes, theatres and temples lie upon unto the fields and to the sky." So the ships on the river Thames, as you know, London is built on the river Thames, and Westminster Bridge runs across the Thames. So he's describing the ships on the river Thames, the towers, the domes, possibly referring to the dome of the St. Paul's Cathedral, theatres and temples, and the open fields and the sky. Okay, all bright and glittering in the smokeless air. "Never did sun more beautifully steep in his first splendor valley, rock or hill. Never saw I never felt a calm so deep." This is an interesting line. This sight of London clad in the morning light, dressed in the morning light, is filling the poet with a sense of calm and with a sense of tranquility. Now once again, going back to the first part of this lecture, I described that poetry for Wordsworth was a spontaneous overflow of powerful emotions recollected in tranquility. Okay, and this tranquility, this calm, for him, it comes from nature. However, the paradox here is that in this particular poem, in this particular sonnet, it is the city of London. It is an urban center, normally something that caused a lot of disillusionment in the Romantic poets, owing to London being the center of the Industrial Revolution. But here it is the city of London which seems to evoke this feeling of calm and tranquility within the poet. Okay, the river, referring to the Thames, glides at its own sweet will. Dear God, the very houses seem asleep, and all that mighty heart is lying still. Okay, he is referring to the houses that seem to be sleeping. The houses are not dead. Just like the inmates within the houses seem to be asleep. They have not yet woken up. And the mighty heart describes to the heart of London. London is being described as a majestic city, as a mighty city. And the mighty heart of London seems to be lying still. It has not yet awoken from its slumber. and it is described as lying still. Okay. Now, one of the new critics, now new criticism is one of the earliest branches of literary criticism. Okay. Now, one of the new critics called Clent Brooks, he is one of his best known works called The Language of Paradox, The Well-Wrought Urn, written in 1947. He is describing this particular poem as a perfect example of a sonnet. Okay. Now, Brooks is known as, he is famous for formulating formalist criticism. Remember this term. And what is formalist criticism? He's talking about, Clent Brooks is talking about formalist criticism by emphasizing upon the interior life of a poem and codifying the principle of closed reading. Now, Brooks is espousing that every poem, and this is very typical of new criticism, that every poem has an internal life of its own, and the poem needs to be, it does not need to be contextualized at all, but it can be read on its own merit. And for example, you might be given a random poem and you might not be knowing the context in which the poem was written. Okay. And this differs greatly from later forms of criticism such as new historist criticism, which locate the poem firmly within the context through which it was written. That means the poem is also a production and it looks at the conditions of production of the poem. Unlike this formalist criticism or new criticism, it looks at the poem on its own merit, as if the poem can be completely dissociated from its condition or context of production, and it can be read as a singular piece in itself. So Clent Brooks talks about the interior life of a poem, and he's codifying the principles of close reading of the poem. So in this particular essay called The Language of Paradox, written in 1947, he is talking about this particular sonnet written by Wordsworth. Okay, and let us take a look at what Brooks is saying. Brooks is saying that in this particular poem by Wordsworth, composed upon Westminster Bridge, Brooks is contending that the poem offers a paradox not in the details but in the situation which the speaker creates. Though London is a man-made marvel, now this is very important to note, and in many respects in opposition to nature, the speaker does not view London as a mechanical and artificial landscape but as a landscape comprised entirely of nature. Since London was created by man and man is a part of nature, London is thus too a part of nature. Okay, so this is the paradox that Brooks seems to be talking about in this poem. Normally, you would find that romantic poets like Wordsworth, they would find their peace and solace and their inspiration within a natural landscape. Okay, within nature and within a natural landscape. But here Wordsworth seems to be overcome by peace and tranquility, not by some sight which he is witnessing in nature, but by the city of London. And remember, London is not a natural city, it is a man-made city. It is also the center of the Industrial Revolution that was the cause of disillusionment for the romantic poets. Okay, so this is the paradox which is encoded within the poem itself, and something that Clent Brooks talks about in his essay. Now, another thing to remember about Wordsworth is that for Wordsworth, the idea of the spots of time, quote unquote, the spots of time, is very important. Now, what do I mean by spots of time? Wordsworth, he seems to contain within his memory certain fragments of time and space which he has witnessed. Okay, and these are then later filtered through his memory and become part of his poem. Okay, now spots of time, they do not refer so much to a physical landscape, rather they refer to an emotional or a mental landscape, a landscape which he later recollects through his memory and makes a part of his poem. So in this particular poem, Westminster Bridge, it becomes a spot of time for Wordsworth. Okay, a spot of time that evokes a sense of calm and tranquility and peace for the poet, and then it sort of becomes a part of his literary composition. Okay, so these are a few things which you need to remember when you're reading this particular sonnet by Wordsworth. Okay, with this I conclude my lecture. Thank you so much.